would want to have another way of like having the user fill out their proper name or whatever, you can handle that however you want, right? And if we go to session, we'll still see that, yeah, the Wappler security identity is still there, and whatever, right? And as far as the session go, we just, we didn't set too much session. We just we're just grabbing it using the server connect, right? So, and then from there, we're in our dashboard. So now, if we could go back to our home page, we still have it on our home page because we had also queried that server on the homepage template, and we had also queried, I believe, no, we didn't query it on the art. So it's just the homepage. So that's kind of like the workaround to get in whatever information you want print out, right? You just have this other server connect that's picking up it, and you could do your database query right here if you wanted or whatever, but I'm just grabbing the global that was set, right? And you can see it's spitting out. I just have two of them there just to make sure they were like working, right? Hence the reason why you see two of them. And moving on, what else am I missing here? So yeah, yep, and our logout. With simpler logout, I believe I went over that. Or code. That's maybe something else I was experiment with. So yeah, so that's how the backend work and how the front end work, right? So again, we have our main template, which we're building out our pages that we don't want to be on the public, and we're using this access admin access here, which is this, and it's a simpler condition that's saying, hey, whenever that global is available, then print it, if else not redirect, right? If that kind of makes sense. So I'm gonna leave this here for now in terms of how the backend part of it work. Hopefully in the next video I can go ahead and explain fully um how the medium implementation of this part go. But this is pretty self-explanatory here. And maybe I'll just jump into it real quick right here. So we have our API that we create, right? So we create our API, as I said in the documentation, create the API first. And once you create the API, so if we go over here, we create our API, call it whatever you want. You give it the identifier. In our case, our identifier was our local host. That's what we were building in Wappler. That's what we put there, right? And as you can see, this is the one that we used, and our identifier is that once we created it, right? And then you just like enable our back, enable access token, and offline nice to have, whatever, right? So you create the API, pretty simple. There's some permission you can set up. The main thing is we just want our machine to machine. Once you create the API, it essentially creates a app for you, which we name the API that. It create the app, and you're just gonna go over here in your API, which run our API right here. You're gonna make sure the app that it creates, you want it to authorize it, right? So we're authorizing this app that we have that it creates, and we're also authorizing the original auth0 app as well, because why not? So again, and then you can also test it, but we're not gonna do that. This is just an overview. You know, that's kind of like how it works. And also a quick start, which is you can click on Node.js if you want, and that's how you would wrap. Originally, this is how you would wrap it in the ads in the Wappler security, whatever. But when it comes to Wappler and trying to figure out how Wappler handle it routes, I can't figure it out because obviously everything kind of starts from this guy right here. Everything kind of starts from your index JS. That's what happened. That's what kick off the whole flow. And then it said, hey, go to lib server, and then you go to your lib server over here, and then it start doing a whole bunch of requirements, and it's saying, hey, let's require the setup and then you go to setup and then config, and then here is probably where you'll put if you want to really wrap OAuth in the code. This is how you'll do it. But I tried once and it blew the entire app out, so I never tried again. This is something that George and the crew, if they really want to figure out how to wrap some identity service, you know, based on how this is all set up, it could be a good way of how they could tell us how to do that. But obviously, Wappler already have their own JWT way of doing stuff, and I don't know where in the Wappler app they've used the security provider to protect the code. So I don't know. I don't know where it starts. I don't know if which one of these things it's in. You know, if it's in the part. I don't know how they. I don't know how Wappler is securing the endpoint when we're using routes over here. So I can't really tell how all of that put together. So that's why I'm using the API to just send, and that's hence the workaround, right? So that's kind of like a little backstory. But anyhow, back to the auth0 API. So you create your API, you're good, and then your API create your application for you. Then once you're in your application, you can pretty much get your client secret, your client ID, your tenant. You can add your logo to your thing. You know, the type is machine to machine, which we want. It's a post. You know, you could add your application login URL, but we're not doing that. We're just basically using the API to handle that for us, right? So, and then we have our logout. Once we log out, go back to that, and obviously our callback URL that we had asked auth0 to pick up on is from there. And then the web origin is obviously, if you're in production, it will be whatever your domain is. But in testing right now, it says localhost 100, right? And then I had just put like that for another test that I was doing. So cross origin, again, if it was production, you put your domain, but in testing, I just did that, right? And pretty self-explanatory. The medium documentation kind of like goes over how to set up everything on the auth0 side. And then I'm just briefly going over everything, and then you have your advanced setting where leave those as default, and your grant type, and here's where you need to make sure you enable authorization code, refresh token, client credential, and password, and whatever. And these are just nice to have. I just implement the whole stack, right? And then obviously you got your endpoints, which is where you'll find your authorized endpoints, your token endpoints, and your user info endpoint, which is the three endpoints that we use in our workaround, right? Also, if you want to use SLAML, however you say that, um, this is one way you could implement that on your end. And then as far as branding goes, come down to branding, you know, this is kind of like what you see on my initial sign-in, right? This is how I have mine set up, which essentially is over here, you know, if I when I go to my profile, and if I log out, I'm just gonna do this. I'm just gonna close this, open, so I can refresh this flow, because this stops that session and tracks it. So if I go there and sign in first time, so this is kind of like how my branding set up. So if you're working with your branding, essentially that's how you would kind of set that up, right? Which is what you're seeing right here, your branding. And then if we go up to our authentication or database, then now here's where the meat of how we integrate the external database with Wappler. So before all of that, you create your database connection, you create it, you give it a name, yada yada yada, and then you hit save, right? And then once that is done, um, once you create it, you will come back over here, and then you just kind of go to custom database, and this is how you technically would implement your endpoint. And it's the same thing, you need your host. If it's MySQL, I'm using MySQL, so I just load the MySQL template and then I add. But before all of that, I make sure I created my variables. And creating a variable is just pretty simple. It could be a case of saying, hey, you know what? Let's say it was, creating like this host, and then you'll put your value. The host would be whatever your domain with. So if it's wherever your database connection with, let's say it was your local host or whatever, right? You will just put that right as your host, and then you'll just add it. And then when you add it, it gives you the encryption. You just copy it right here, and then you will just for part of your connection, that's how you create your host. So I just went ahead and created the variables that I need, which was the host, the user, the database name, and the password. And again, this documentation kind of go over the whole 9 yard, you know, step by step. It just shows you step by step really how to like get all of that set up, right? So that's kind of like the walk around. So anyways, so you have your connection, your MySQL connection, you connect that, and then your query select statement, which in my case, my database that I had over here in MySQL. I hope I'm still logged in. Not. Anyways, let's just look at the Medium article, right? For my database setup. Scroll in. So this is what my database looked like, right? And this is what the table looked like. Yeah, so essentially I have this um, code, email, password, role, yada yada, and you can see it's I have an enum and it's set as default to read, and I create the same, so the same stuff that that auth0 is asking for. I just cannot use the same naming convention, right? Because essentially when you create a database for this for the first time, here's an example one that I was using. Go to custom database. When you load a template for the first time, whether it's MongoDB or whether it's MySQL, it kind of gives you the callback URL or whatever. So I just kind of like just name these in my um name those based on my database. So if the create script same way, right? You load it, you pay attention to the the fields that it has, and that's how you kind of like lay out your database, right? Verify. You get in the field name based on the template, right? And you just set up your database fields in the same manner. So if that makes sense, that's kind of like how I did hack at it, right? I just look at these template one by one, I load them, kind of see what the query string is, and then that's how I set up my whole database. So yeah, so essentially now go back to database, go back to the active database that I have. So you just basically custom database, connecting, create your variable array, and then your query statement. You just whatever you want for the login, you query the IDE, the user, the nickname. So obviously in our Wappler, our security provider identities, email, so we want that, and then we also want the password, and yeah. So on login, those are what I requested, and goes to say those were the same thing that I have set up as well in the API that I'm defining right over here. So nickname, email, And yeah, obviously we don't want to print the password out there, so we just in this endpoint that I'm requested, that's what I'm requesting. And then, but obviously for your login, when somebody's logging in, you need a password and an email. And the callback, I'm just calling back the user ID, the nickname, the email, and the ID, right? That's how that kind of like plays out. And then for the create, no, it's kind of the same thing. You have a connection, and then we're saying, hey, insert into the user table, which essentially is the user table that we created in the database right here, right? So, and for that, once we insert it, we're inserting the password, the email, the tenant, the connection, and the verify. We just set this to false, right? And these are some OAuth field name that once you put them there, it's automatically gonna pick them up here in the whole tenant, right? And then for verify, same thing. We connect, and then we're saying, hey, update the user email verify from over here when we had first created it from false to true. And this is after the new user sign up, they get a verification email or whatever, right? And this goes into the next process of is this under branding? Yep, so email provider. So you want to make sure you set up an email provider. I use SendGrid to handle that for me, and it's just a case of like the API key and how you set up that in SendGrid. You can check out the SendGrid documentation on how to set up your SNTP kind of thing. So go back to application, back to database, back to our database. So that's what you need to run your verification flow, right? You need to make sure you have your SMTP set up. And then this is what it looks like. And then for change password, same thing, connection. And then it's just like update, yada, yada, yada. Where whatever email we find is equal to the email that's in the update form, right? And get user. And of course, obviously, auth0 is the one that handling all of this for us, right? And we're saying, hey, when we're getting user, we want to get the ID of the user, the nickname, the email, right? So that's kind of like what we want to get when we're getting our user as a test. And then delete. Obviously, when you're calling your API, you can call a lot more in the get user info, but when we're setting it up, we're just setting it up with like the basic, right, to test it. So kind of like what this would look like if you want to test and try. If we're saying, hey, let's test it, we try it, it essentially send back us, based on the email, right? Likewise, if we're changing password, you know, whatever email we have set up in the change password and we put it in, then we update our password, but I'm not gonna do that. So, and then delete the same thing, right? We connection and we're saying delete, delete, delete where the ID equal. And if we're gonna try this, it would be whatever ID we put in there that's in our database or whatever it picks up, right? So that's it for that's it. That's a quick overview